Medicaid has grown by 50%. So what's happened is that Medicaid was originally intended for children and poor families, children and people who were disabled and couldn't work to provide health care. Count me in for that, makes a lot of sense. Along comes President Obama. He expands Medicaid to include able-bodied adults for the first time. And what he did was he incentivized states to include these people in Medicaid. For every new able-bodied adult, you get 90% of the cost from the federal government, 10% from the states. And Medicaid has grown 50%, is going to take over Medicare because of what President Obama did. So what are we going to do? We're going to try to deal with that in a responsible way. What about this idea? If you're not a child, if you're not disabled, you're able-bodied, and you don't have any children under 14, we're going to have a 20-hour-a-week work requirement for you to stay on Medicaid. That's a good thing. It's a good thing for the individual involved to be working. It's a good thing for the taxpayer for them to be working. But that seems to be a crime on the other side, to ask somebody to work that can work. How many people out there are listening to this? I don't know how many you are, but are you working every day? Are you going to work with kids? A lot of people do that, by the way. So one of the reforms in this bill is to introduce a work requirement to the additional population that President Obama put on Medicaid that was never intended on the original purpose of Medicaid. This work requirement is going to save a bunch of money. Finally, we're addressing the biggest scam I've seen in a very long time. Somewhere along the line, somebody figured out that at the state level, that if you tax doctors and hospitals and medical providers on the funds they get and take that revenue, you can actually get more Medicaid money. This is a money laundering scheme. It needs to come to an end as we know it. States have gone up to 6% of a provider tax. They take that tax revenue and they use it to get more money from the federal government. The hospitals and doctors don't lose, they get the money back. The state doesn't lose, they get more money. The only group that loses is the federal government, and we're deep, deep in debt. So we're going to reform the provider tax system that I think is abusive, very abusive. As to Medicaid, it's on a growth trajectory that will overtake Medicare. Now is the time to put common sense reform in place, not only to slow the growth, and we're not talking about cutting Medicaid, we're slowing the growth, but try to create some sense of fiscal responsibility. So to our chairman of the Finance Committee, you have constructed a package better than 2017. You have included some growth elements in the package that will allow the economy to grow because it will be in businesses' interest to invest. And I want to applaud you for this growth package. Now, what does this all mean? Current policy, current law. If you do what I have decided to do, make the tax cuts permanent, and you implement these reforms to Medicaid in other areas, you will, over the next 10 years, reduce the deficit by $507 billion. That's CBO, not me. Now, how do you do that? You grow the economy, and you begin to control spending in a common sense way. Most people can relate to that because they do it all the time. People at home sometimes have to work extra to meet the needs of their family, and they have to tighten their belt. So what have we achieved here in the one big beautiful bill? We're going to make your border as secure as it possibly can be and never go back to open borders. We're going to put in place border security measures to keep it secure. We're going to make the tax cuts permanent so your taxes do not go up in December of this year, and we're going to add additional pro-growth policies to help our economy. We're going to reform Medicaid in a way that makes sense, deal with the waste, fraud, and abuse of that program so that there's more money for the disabled and children, because the more money you give the able-bodied who can work, it's less money for children and people on disability. And one of the most perverse things about what President Obama did is that the reimbursement rates to states are higher for able-bodied adults than they are for disabled people and children, 90%. So President Obama created a system to entice states, lure them in, to add people to Medicaid that are not disabled, not poor children, because his goal was to put everybody in the country under government-run health care, and the government reimbursement is higher for an able-bodied person than it is for a poor child or a disabled person. And we're going to stop that, because that's not fair. It's not fair to the taxpayer, and it's not fair to the population that we're trying to help. So we're going to control spending in a common sense way. We're going to revitalize our military at a time of great need. We're going to secure the border, and we're going to make the tax cuts that expire in December permanent so we don't have to deal with this every 10 years. It's a big, beautiful bill if you believe in cutting people's taxes, securing the border, having a strong military, and controlling government spending. It is a nightmare, this bill, for those who want to raise taxes, who want open borders, who want a weak military, and never want to control one dime of federal spending. This bill is your nightmare if you're for open borders. This bill is your nightmare if you want the government to grow without any limitation. This bill is your nightmare if you want a weak military, because it's going to give us a stronger military. So why do we have this debate? That's what they, through years of effort, have done. The military is always the last thing that gets funded when they're in charge. When they're in charge, you have no border. Completely broken, millions of people running through our country, lawless. When they're in charge, there is no limit to growing the government. They entice everybody to grow the government. And when they're in charge, they're never going to cut your taxes in any meaningful way. The tax rates since 2017, the top rate has been 37. If these tax cuts expire, your taxes, if you're a family of four, will go up by $1,700. And we'll go back to the 39.6 rate. Here's a question for the country. How much should the federal government take of anybody's income? What's a fair share? 37% seems pretty damn fair to me. Over a third of what you make, and that doesn't count state and local taxes. The number they would pick is probably a 90. So is 37% fair? I think yes. Most Americans think 25% is fair. You know, Jesus wants 10%. There is no number they won't embrace. So somewhere between 90 and 10, 37 is fair. This is not rewarding the wealthy. It's creating a number that makes sense. 37% going to the federal government is a fair share. It's over a third of what you make.
Right now, chat's on the same page, 100%
And that
to
doesn't
no.
count state and local taxes. This has been long, it's been hard, but we're about done. In a couple of days, we're going to pass the one big beautiful bill. President Trump's going to sign it. Mike Crapo and his staff deserve at least one day off. I cannot thank you enough for what you and your team have done. To my budgeteers, you have been terrific. You have worked really hard. To CBO and Joint Tax and all these people, hats off to your efforts to get us a quality product. To all of my colleagues who've rowed the boat with us, we're about to reach the shore. And when this boat comes ashore, every family in America can have a sigh of relief. Your taxes will not go up this December. You'll get a Christmas present of not having a tax increase. To those who've been yearning for a secure border, it will be secure. To those men and women in uniform, you're going to get some help and you desperately need it. And to those who think we should do something about the government's growth in a common sense way, we've achieved that. I am very proud of this bill. I'm very proud of President Trump. I'm very proud of the Republican team that has gotten us to this point. And to my Democratic colleagues, we'll work together where we can, but nobody over here ever expects you to do anything about the border because you've proven you can't. Nobody over here believes you're ever going to reduce the size of government because you don't want to. So the bottom line is we're about to make history, Mr. President. This is your first term. I don't know what comes later for you. I hope you're here a long time if that's what you want to be. You're a great senator. You're a good businessman. You've made a real success story. Family from Columbia. You've created a lot of job opportunity. I doubt if you'll ever do anything more important than this. Senator Crapo, you've been here a while. You're one of the smartest guys I've ever met. Everything you've done all your life has led to this moment. This is what you were built to do. This is what you were meant to do. You're the right man at the right time to do what this country desperately needs to stay on track to be safe and prosperous. To all my colleagues who are going to vote for this bill, you should be proud. And you should talk about it because it's going to make us all safer and it's going to make us all more prosperous. Me being budget chairman is a quirk in the history of the Senate. This is not my thing normally, but I have really gotten into it. And I've learned a lot thanks to my colleagues. And I'm proud to have the honor of being budget chairman at a time I think it matters the most. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the following staff members from my staff and from Senator Merkley's staff be given all access floor passes for the consideration of the bill. Caitlin Wilson, Lillian Meadows, Scott Graber, Walker Turlock, Taylor Reedy, Democratic staff Mike Jones, Melissa Pistner, Josh Smith, and Tyler Evilsizer. Tyler, Evilsizer. I ask that unanimous consent.
Without objection.
With that, I will yield to my good friend from Idaho.
There's one more behind it.
Huh? Oh, wait a minute.
Nope.
That the use of calculators, whatever they are, be permitted on the floor of the Senate during consideration of the bill.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
I recognize.
Hell yeah,
Senator
give
from
everyone a
Idaho.
calculator so we
Thank
know
you,
what's
Mr.
happening.
President. And first of all, let me thank my colleague from South Carolina, Senator Graham, for his very kind words. I return the same kind of compliments to him for his great work in helping to build this bill and get us moved to this point. I'm going to make just a few remarks right now in response to some of the allegations and myself. But the things that were said this morning just have to be responded to. First of all, it is said that the reason that we are going to increase the debt ceiling in the bill is because we are spending so much money and driving the deficit up. Well, first of all, our bill drives the deficit down, not up. And secondly, The reason we are dealing with the debt ceiling in the bill is because under the previous administration's operations, the debt ceiling has already been breached. It was breached on January 2nd. And we are limping along with extraordinary measures, is what we call them here in Washington, to try to keep the government funded until Congress can extend the debt ceiling. This has nothing to do with President Trump. It happened before he even was sworn into office. It has nothing to do with this bill. It has to do with the profligate spending that drove us into a breach of the debt ceiling on January 2. Secondly, my colleagues on the other side tried to characterize our choice of the current policy baseline as a gimmick and said it's never been done before. Well, they should have been more careful in their words, because the current policy baseline is currently utilized in the current CBO baseline for many spending programs. In fact, many spending programs, about $2.5 trillion of spending programs, are measured under the current treatment, which the Democrats have been using for decades, to make it so they don't have to count spending increases as an increase in the deficit. They are correct that that policy has never been applied to taxes before, because it was not intended to apply to taxes. That ruling and that system that was set up was intentionally designed to favor tax increases over spending cuts and to force Congress to increase taxes and increase spending. It was a strategy to achieve what we all know of as tax and spend. And no matter how they try to cover it over today in their debate, it comes down to this. They are furious that we refuse to raise taxes in America by $4.3 trillion on Americans. And they claim that our refusal to raise your taxes, America, is going to run up the deficit because they can't get $4 trillion more of your tax revenue into their pockets. Well, the first failure of that rationale is, if you believe that you give them $4.5 trillion by letting them raise your taxes again, if you believe they're going to use that to pay the debt down, let me tell you, there's not a tax increase that I've seen in this Congress in my lifetime that was used to pay the debt down. It was used to increase spending. It's called tax and spend. And it's that bias in our scoring system that we are fixing today. We are fixing it so that current policy is how you treat taxes, just like you treat $2.5 trillion of spending this year in your scoring system. We're evening the balance board between taxing and spending. And America should sigh a sigh of relief that finally we are fixing our scoring procedures so that we don't have a built-in drive to increase taxes. Let's put it another way. One of my colleagues said, just even children can understand the difference between $1 trillion and $0. I think they can also understand that if you don't raise taxes, you're not changing the tax code. You're making it bring in the same revenue that it brought in before. You're not increasing the deficit, you're protecting their wallets.
Yeah, this is a
And the
tough
bottom
point,
line here
Chad.
is very simple.
I'm back and
I think
forth on
every
that.
American, at least 90% of them, intuitively understand that the refusal to let your taxes go up by $4 trillion is not a deficit increase. You are not the responsible. Us keeping your money in your pocket is not making you responsible for increasing the deficit. Deficit increases come when Congress keeps spending your money and never, ever controlling its spending. The problem is not a lack of revenue. It is too much spending. So let's make it clear. This is not a gimmick. The gimmick is the one that's been used for all these years. We are making a balance between the treatment of tax and spend so that those taxpayers in America have at least a fair chance against the rules of this chamber. Now, one other thing that I think needs to be made here is there was a lot of talk on the other side, and then I'll stop and bring my longer speech later. One other point that needs to be made here is that it was suggested that this has never been done before, even on taxes. Well, there's a president named President Obama who faced a similar situation like we face today. Only then, he was president when a huge tax cut that President Bush had accomplished was expiring. And all of those tax cuts that President Bush had been able to achieve were going to go away, and everybody's taxes were going to go up. And President Obama said, no, I'm not going to let that happen. So he put a bill out on the floor to stop those tax increases from happening. And he was attacked, actually, for increasing the deficit by not letting taxes go up. And President Obama, through his OMB deputy director, said that keeping tax policy current should be scored under a current policy, and that if his act in letting those tax increases be kept in place should be scored as current policy, not as a tax increase. So you've got one of your own presidents from the Democratic Party saying that letting existing tax law stay in place and protecting against huge tax increases on the American people is the appropriate approach to take, that current policy, and those are their words, current policy is the way we should treat tax policy. So I say to everybody in America who's been hearing all of the politics of fear about what we're doing here and running up the deficit, need to remember that only in Washington, D.C. is the refusal to raise your taxes an increase in the deficit. And we're not going to let that happen. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
I feel like he hit a lot of the topics that everyone's thinking about. I'm iffy about a couple of the points that he tried to push across, especially with the spending deficit. Yeah, guys, I don't know. This is a tough one for me. Right now, our chat is heavily leaning on the no side. 67% say that we should not pass this bill. Everyone, make sure you drop your votes in the poll.
If no
Let's
one
see what
yields
y'all say.
time will be charged equally to both sides.
Are we going back and forth between the Democratic and Republic side, or is it all Republic and then all Democrat? I haven't caught a pattern yet. I'm not too sure. I'm seeing a lot of good points in chat, too. Make sure you guys fill that up. I want to hear what you guys have to say. I like hearing from the people a little bit more than I do the state, if that makes sense. Let's see who comes up next. It's going to be... here we go.
Children and people with disabilities. This bill will blow up our national debt, kick millions of people off of their health care, and take food off of families' tables while cutting food assistance. And for what? What our colleagues are mortgaging our country's future for? What are they slashing health care and food assistance to pay for? Well, they're doing it for tax cuts for billionaires. So before my colleagues rush to pass this irresponsible, reckless legislation, let's take a moment to go through exactly how much harm this bill will actually cause, and hear from the people in my state who are going to suffer if this law becomes law. To start, this bill will blow up the national debt. Since President George Washington gave his farewell address, our nation's leaders have warned against the dangers of accumulating a national debt. 15 years ago, Admiral Mike Mullen, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stated, quote, "The most significant threat to our national security is our debt." The national debt is at an all-time high, $36.2 trillion. And just in the last 16 years, it has tripled Our annual deficits frequently exceed $1.5 trillion, including a record $3.1 trillion deficit in fiscal year 2020 during the Trump administration. Unfortunately, these are the first of many grave financial milestones that we face. Within the next decade, our country will spend more on servicing the debt than we do on any other
Don't worry, I'll
federal
scream it out.
account
Appreciate it, you guys.
outside of Social Security. Our fiscal house is basically on fire. But if our Republican colleagues jam through this bill, it's not going to pour water on that fire, it's going to pour gasoline on those flames. Democrats have tried to make efforts to pay down that debt in recent years. In fact, under the Inflation Reduction Act, a law that this bill attempts to actually gut, we reduced the deficit in that bill by nearly $250 billion. And in 2023, we passed the Bipartisan Fiscal Responsibility Act, which responsibly addressed the debt ceiling and had the potential to reduce deficits by up to $1.5 trillion. But unfortunately, the bill before us basically wipes all of that away. And I have always said that I'm open to making smart cuts to spending, but that those cuts should be matched with increases in revenues. Doing so would put us back on a sustainable financial path. Our Republican colleagues are doing the exact opposite. They're making drastic cuts to revenue, and according to the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation, the tax provisions in this bill alone would decrease revenues by $4.2 trillion and add $3 trillion to our national debt. This is a recipe for disaster. If we face another emergency, like a pandemic or global financial crisis, we will be too hamstrung by our debt to respond effectively. We are on the brink of a financial disaster, and passing this bill could push us over that edge. Also, my Republican colleagues can cut taxes for billionaires. At the same time, our Republican colleagues are not making smart, sensible spending cuts to cover the costs that these billionaire tax cuts will mean. Instead, they're gutting health care for millions of Americans, including hundreds of thousands of Michiganders. It's reckless and it is wrong. Medicaid is a lifeline for people in every single community across this country. It ensures that millions of Michiganders and Americans can have access to quality, affordable health care. And right now, folks across my home state of Michigan are scared. Scared about what this bill will mean for their families. I've heard from thousands of my constituents from every corner of the state of Michigan on how these cuts are going to hurt them. So today, I just want to tell you, through my constituent stories, just how detrimental this bill will be for most Americans. Take Isaac from Lansing, for example, who says Medicaid is the only lifeline he has to pay for the medicine that literally keeps him alive. We've also seen how more and more Michiganders and people all across our nation have shouldered the burden of serving as a primary caregiver for an aging parent. It's the ultimate gift that we can give to the people who have raised us. But the cost of critical nursing home and assisted living care continues to rise. Medicaid has become an essential way for our aging seniors to pay for the care that they need. Take Gwen from Grand Rapids, who says she wouldn't be able to pay for an assisted living facility for her grandmother without Medicaid. Many of us know someone, or maybe even love someone, who lives with a disability. Thanks to Medicaid, people with disabilities can get the care that allows them to live healthy and independent lives. That is the case for Wanda from Westland, who takes medication for an eye condition. Without Medicaid, she would not be able to afford her medication, and she could actually go blind. As too many of us know from personal experiences or from friends and loved ones, our country is facing a mental health crisis. Medicaid has become a saving grace for those who desperately need mental health care, but simply cannot afford it. Take Alan from Fort Gratiot, who says losing Medicaid would feel like losing the lives he's been given back through mental health care from Medicaid. Under this bill, rural communities will be especially impacted by cuts to Medicaid. In some counties in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, there's only one health care provider, meaning some Michiganders will have to travel up to 50 miles to get routine or emergency care. Medicaid helps keep these hospitals open. And if this bill passes, people in these rural communities are going to be cut off from basic health services. Medicaid also plays an essential role in making sure that children across Michigan get the care that they need. I heard from Gladys, a mother from Flint, who says Medicaid is the only reason her kids can get their asthma medication or have regular health checkups. Expecting mothers also reached out to share their concerns. While she is busy preparing to welcome a newborn baby into the world, Chelsea from Fenville is now afraid that she will lose her access to both pre- and post-natal care under this absolutely disastrous bill. I simply can't understand how my Republican colleagues would leave thousands of people across Michigan without the care that they need, all so they can give a tax break to billionaires. On top of that, my Republican colleagues are also proposing deep, harmful cuts to food assistance delivered through SNAP. SNAP serves as an absolute lifeline for millions of Americans, including children, seniors, people with disabilities, and working families.
Think about
So
the SNAP
simply put,
benefits.
if
That's
this
important
bill
too.
is passed, it will mean people in Michigan and all across our country will go hungry. They will not be able to put food on the table while billionaires pay less taxes. That is just wrong. But it also makes no economic sense either. Every dollar in SNAP benefits generates more than $1.50 in economic activity. This supports local grocery stores, farmers all across our country, and the entire food supply chain. So on top of jeopardizing families' ability to put food on the table, to feed their children, these proposed SNAP cuts would also hurt businesses and jobs, particularly in rural America and in low-income areas. This bill produces the most amount of pain for the least amount of gain of any legislation that I can remember in all the years that I've had the privilege of serving here in the Senate. Mr. President, I can't believe that we are standing here debating this reckless, irresponsible bill. The harm this bill will do to the American people and to the people in my state of Michigan who are counting on Medicaid for health care and on food assistance to help feed their families is absolutely reprehensible. The damage this bill will do to our nation's economic security is not only reckless, it is unconscionable. This is not what our constituents want us to be focused on.
Yo, Fletcher,
They
thanks for
want
the
us to
sub on
help
YouTube.
make
Welcome in
their
everyone
life
new.
better. But instead of focusing on that, here we are on the brink of passing a bill so irresponsible that it will destroy our country's economic health, harm millions of Americans, all so a handful of billionaires, the wealthiest of the wealthy, can have another tax break. Mr. President, I will never support such a reckless and catastrophic plan. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Okay, so the Democrats hit a lot of points. Really, it was more testimonial, wasn't it? It was like a lot more stories from the people, which tends to be a more democratic thing to do. The Republican side, I guess, is going to be next, and they're going to probably hit more numbers and more facts. It's just how these talks seem to lean. We'll go ahead and try to skip forward. Yeah, here it
Taxpayers
is.
in all income groups would see massive tax hikes. And a point that my colleagues on the other side seem to consistently forget or ignore is that the vast majority of them, $2.6 trillion worth of those tax cuts or tax increases, would fall on taxpayers making less than $400,000 per year. And the vast majority of that is on taxpayers making and earning in the middle and lower middle income categories. No. But before I go on to discuss what would happen, I want to address an issue that is just a constant theme on the other side, and that is that this bill is going to be a huge increase in the deficit. Now here's a quick handwritten chart that my colleague from South Carolina made quickly to respond to them. You heard the previous speaker say that CBO has scored this bill to have a huge multi-trillion-dollar deficit increase. The fact is that CBO has scored this bill to have a $507 billion deficit reduction. You heard that right, a $507 billion deficit reduction. And later on in my remarks, I will point out that that score doesn't even take into account the growth in the economy and the revenue that will come to our Treasury from revitalizing and giving a boost to our economy. So now let's go to the next chart. What will happen if we don't do this? What will happen if we do what the Democrats are demanding that we do? And that is to let this tax increase happen so that they can say they're going to use it to pay the deficit down. The average family of four would see a tax hike of $1,700, and their child tax credit would be cut in half.
These are the numbers.
20 million small business owners would face massive tax hikes, with some of them facing rates as high as 43%. The standard deduction, which simplifies tax filing for 90% of Americans, would be cut in half. Small businesses and farms would see their death exemption cut in half. The Council of Economic Advisors warns us that this $4 trillion tax hike would also lead to an economic downturn and potential recessionary headwinds, noting that the impacts would disproportionately fall on young people, minorities, and workers without college degrees. We've been working for more than a year on legislation that prevents that outcome and provides an opportunity for us to have additional tax relief that is specifically targeted to benefit low and middle income families and workers. Despite the rhetoric of fear, our critics' rhetoric about tax cut as being for billionaires and corporations, the reality of this legislation prevents a massive tax hike across the board and overwhelmingly benefits middle-class households and job creators. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation, this bill provides more than $600 billion, that's $600 billion more of new tax relief for hardworking Americans. How does it do that? $73 billion in inflation tax relief targeted at income brackets below $100,000 per year. $205 billion in tax relief to the 90% of taxpayers who claim the standard deduction. $93 billion in additional tax relief for seniors through a $6,000 bonus exemption. $124 billion investment in children of low and middle income families, in addition to the permanent doubled child tax credit. I'm going to say that again. The permanent doubled child tax credit. The significant tax relief we are providing to hardworking families includes permanent lower tax rates, letting Americans keep more of their hard-earned money, permanent increased and enhanced standard deduction, claimed by over 90% of taxpayers. On top of making that doubled child tax credit permanent, we are also increasing it for tens of millions of families. Tax relief for seniors in the form of a $6,000 bonus exemption for low and middle income seniors,
These seem cool.
slashing their tax burden. No tax on tips for millions of tipped workers like waitresses, barbers, hairstylists, and taxi drivers. No tax on overtime for millions of America's hourly workers. who work overtime and keep America running. No tax on auto loan interest for new cars made in the United States, allowing the hardworking families of America to fully deduct auto loan interest on American-made cars. Enhanced 529 education savings accounts, making education expenses more affordable and accessible for families. New Trump savings accounts for newborns and children set up to the age of 18, building financial security for the next generation. We make child care more accessible and affordable for working families by enhancing the Child and Dependent Care Credit and the Dependent Care Assistance Program. The list goes on and on. We extend the paid family and medical leave credit and expand health savings and accounts for health care expenses. We repeal onerous IRS reporting requirements on gig workers, reduce the paperwork burden for small businesses, and much more. And all of this just on the individual side of the code. The business side of the tax code has the potential to generate phenomenal economic growth. When my Republican colleagues and I began talking about how to best extend and enhance the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we agreed that one of our top priorities was to make it permanent. The reforms we made in 2017, including lower rates for corporations and small business owners, along with the international tax reforms, increased domestic investment, boosted economic growth, and increased take-home pay. A growing economy powered a strong labor market. Workers saw record wage growth, and the unemployment rate fell dramatically to the lowest in 50 years at 3.5%. Corporate inversions, which we used to debate endlessly, or businesses leaving America, became a thing of the past. They literally ended, and America became the place to do business again. Capital formation exploded in the United States. Restoring these critical business provisions and making them permanent is a key to driving additional growth and investment in the United States. For businesses that spur investment and economic activity across the country, this bill makes the 20% small business deduction permanent, enabling job creation and spurring local economic activity. Restores and makes permanent full expensing for domestic research and development, encouraging domestic innovation. Restores and makes permanent full expensing for new capital investments, like machinery and equipment, boosting domestic production. Restores and makes permanent interest deductibility, helping to finance critical domestic investments and keep America globally competitive. It includes full expensing for new factories and factory improvements to accelerate domestic manufacturing. Permanently renews and enhances the Opportunity Zone program, driving $100+ billion of investment to rural and distressed communities. According to the Tax Foundation, permanence for the bill's 4 cost recovery provisions I've just reviewed would more than double the long-run economic effect. The National Association of Manufacturers predicts $248 billion in economic growth will come from the manufacturing sector alone, along with over 1 million jobs and over $100 billion in new wages. The National Federation of Independent Businesses says that making the small business deduction permanent will create 1.2 million jobs over 10 years, growing to 2.4 million jobs in the long run. That growth also means more federal revenue created right along the way. And the Council of Economic Advisors estimates that the tax legislation alone, this tax legislation alone, will drive more than $2 trillion in offsetting deficit reduction, thanks to permanent provisions that power economic growth and incentivize investment. Over a 10-year window, with this legislation in effect, the Council of Economic Advisors estimates that debt as a share of GDP will fall to 94%, compared to 117% if the Trump tax cuts expire. And this chart is important to look at. This is what happens to our deficit if we pass this tax legislation and grow our economy. And this is what happens if we don't. The red line is what happens if we don't. Over a 10-year window with this legislation in effect, as this chart shows, the estimate is 94% compared to 117% if the Trump tax cuts expire. So while my colleagues on the other side complain and complain that we will not let taxes go up, this is what will happen if they do go up. Far from adding to the deficit, this legislation will finally put us on a sound financial footing as we power growth and curb spending. For those who claim that this bill will add over $4 trillion to the deficit, it bears repeating. Preventing a $4 trillion tax hike is not the same as deficit spending. And those who say that we should let a $4 trillion tax hike go into effect to pay down the national debt, every tax increase that Congress has adopted for as long as I can remember was not used to pay down the national debt. It was used to increase spending. And that's exactly what is going to happen if the Democrats have their way and force this tax hike to happen. It was used by Congress to spend more money, not to reduce debt. Extending current tax policy means that tax revenue as a percent of GDP will remain relatively unchanged. We do not have a revenue problem in America. We have a spending problem. That's why we asked JCT to score this legislation under a more realistic scenario using a current policy baseline. The Council of Economic Advisors estimates that making the Trump tax cuts permanent, combined with other Trump administration pro-growth policies like regulatory reform and so forth, it will increase federal revenues by more than $4 trillion, far more than offsetting any deficit estimates. When combined with the $1.6 trillion in spending reductions, this bill represents historic savings for taxpayers, far exceeding the spending reductions in the past by hundreds of billions of dollars. And I want to look at this chart. I've talked a lot about tax cuts and protecting against tax increases and economic growth that happens from that. But reducing spending is another critical priority that we must address. And in addition to the pro-growth tax policy that I've just described, we cut spending by $1.6 trillion. This chart shows how other bills have tried to take a shot at reducing spending in the past. We far exceed any spending reduction bill that Congress has ever passed. We're paying attention to the revenue side, and we're paying attention to the spending side. To achieve this record level of savings, we are slashing President Biden's Green New Deal spending and promoting an America First energy policy. We are eliminating hundreds of billions of dollars of the Green New Deal subsidies, including ending wasteful credits like the EV tax credit. We stop penalizing fossil fuels in favor of unreliable and expensive green energy, and instead support consistent energy sources, making energy affordable again. We are also rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse in federal spending programs, as my colleague from South Carolina mentioned, like those that we have identified in Medicaid. This will not reduce benefits for those who are qualified and for whom Medicaid was intended. It will reduce waste, fraud, and abusive scams that are being used to get the American taxpayer to funnel money into states or into other programs. This program was created to help pregnant women, children, and seniors in America and those with disabilities. We are continuing to protect them. They will not lose benefits, and the politics of fear that you hear constantly are simply false. But in recent years, the Democrats have incentivized Medicaid to enroll healthy Americans and illegal immigrants, driving up costs for taxpayers and risking the program's sustainability for those who need it the most. This is what has happened. This is what's happening to the enrollment and the spending in Medicaid. The fate of this expansion is an unsustainable path and puts the future of the program at risk, including the United States federal debt. As spending has surged, so have inappropriate payments and ineligible enrollments, along with gimmicks and loopholes. People are alarmed by these statistics, but official reports indicate that the federal government made $543 billion in inappropriate Medicaid payments from 2015 through 2024. Some experts think that that number is closer to $1 trillion. That is what we are addressing in this legislation. We have the responsibility to ensure that programs like Medicaid work efficiently and effectively and remain financially viable for those for whom it was designed to help. For months, my Democrat colleagues have engaged in the politics of fear, warning that Republicans are going to rip this critical program from those most in need. Let me be clear. This legislation does not take Medicaid away from any recipients for whom the program was designed
Hey,
to help.
Dustin, nothing's wrong with that.
Children, the elderly,
You just sound like you
the
need a buddy.
disabled or infirm, adults caring for children, and elderly relatives are protected by this bill. We would not be honoring our obligation to these recipients if we allow the program to continue to balloon, forcing vulnerable populations to compete for available resources with able-bodied adults who refuse to work. As one father recently wrote in the Wall Street Journal, Medicaid was created to help people like my son. He is 17, has severe autism and epilepsy, and needs constant attention. Yet thanks to Obamacare's Medicaid expansion, he is stuck on a multi-year waiting list for an in-home care because able-bodied adults are competing for the same results. CBO estimates that over 1.4 million illegal aliens are receiving Medicaid benefits. I'm talking about those who are not United States citizens and are not legally in the United States, receiving Medicaid benefits.
Yeah, that cracked me up too.
And pushing those like this man's 17-year-old son out of his opportunity to get access to those benefits. Brett Guthrie, the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House, correctly notes, every dollar misspent on illegal immigrants and ineligible individuals in the Medicaid program means less money going to our children, our pregnant women and mothers, individuals, and others who are disabled and seniors. Republicans are committed to preserving and strengthening Medicaid for the people Medicaid was intended to serve. That starts with making common sense reforms to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse in the program. This bill targets rampant fraud in the program by removing illegal aliens, deceased recipients, or those enrolled in multiple states. It eliminates wasteful spending by ensuring that Medicaid payments align with levels in Medicare and
Appreciate
other
that,
spending
brother.
programs, and increases the frequency of eligibility checks. It requires more personal accountability and promotes pathways to work for able-bodied adults. The work requirements proposed in this legislation are simple. Many people are amazed that they're so easy to meet and yet so rigorously opposed. If you are an able-bodied adult without dependents, you can qualify for taxpayer-funded Medicaid by spending 20 hours per week working or participating in work training or going to school or participating in community service or volunteer work. The majority of Americans agree that these rules are responsible guardrails to protect a program that was designed to protect America's most vulnerable Americans. The bill also corrects abusive practices by freezing and reducing provider taxes, a financial gimmick used by states to increase federal spending that they receive. For those concerned about funding for rural hospitals during the transition back to responsible funding levels, the legislation creates a bridge funding system to help stabilize rural hospitals and enhance their long-term financial solvency. And while Democrats claim Republicans are slashing Medicaid spending, the reality is that even with these reforms, Medicaid spending is projected to continue to grow by billions of dollars over the next 10 years. Only in Washington is a smaller increase in spending considered a cut. In reality, these reforms will improve, protect, and preserve Medicaid for the most vulnerable Americans. We've had a very robust debate over how to best deliver on President Trump's agenda, and I'm proud of what we achieved in this legislation. The tax provisions in our bill, from permanent extension of the lower tax rate to the increased child tax credit to the permanent tax relief for businesses, will deliver financial security for American families and grow our economy. The health care provisions will protect and preserve Medicaid for the Americans that the program was designed to serve. And while more work remains, this bill's economic growth, combined with deficit reduction that we have in it, finally puts our country on a much better fiscal trajectory. Speaking of work, I would be remiss if I did not take a moment to thank the excellent staff from the Joint Committee on Taxation, the Congressional Budget Office, and the Senate Legislative Council for the hard work and countless hours they have put in to get us to this point. Some of them have been working with us on these provisions for years, and we greatly appreciate your partnership in this effort. I ask unanimous consent to have these individuals' names printed in the record. Thank you. I also have to thank my incredible staff who have foregone sleep over the past several months to provide timely, indispensable insight, facts, legislative text, counsel, and so much more. Without them, we would not be at this point and ready to deliver this much needed growth-focused policy for the American people. I ask unanimous consent to have the names of my entire Finance Committee staff printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Even with all that, and all that we accomplish in this legislation, there are dozens of additional good ideas, smart policies, and common sense reforms that we were not able to include today. And I commit to working with my colleagues to advance those goals as well as we move forward. But today's historic legislation is more than a good start and will pay dividends for American families. Extending good tax policy, delivering targeted relief, and reining in wasteful spending, as achieved in this bill, is the best way to restore economic prosperity and opportunity for all Americans. I look forward to getting it to the President's desk as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. President.
Yeah, there's a lot of good points coming from both sides. He just seems to have a little bit, I don't know, there's like an air about him. When he talked in the vote last night with our involvement in the Iran,
Mr. President,
I recognize it,
he
Democrat
gave
whip.
me, I don't know, snaky
Mr.
vibes.
President,
but
we're here today debating
he did come with a lot of
a
facts.
clumsily
or so
assembled
proposed.
package, still a work in progress, that would rip away health care from 16 million American
Snake
families.
oil salesman. I don't know if that's good or
Give
bad. You know
tax
what I mean?
breaks to millionaires, billionaires, and our largest corporations. Think about that for a moment. The Republicans have decided that the best avenue to generate revenue that they can then give in tax breaks to wealthy people is to eliminate health insurance coverage for 16 million Americans. That's going to have a dramatic impact on their lives. If you have ever been a young father with a baby with a serious medical problem and you had no health insurance, you'll never forget it as long as you live. I know, I've been there. The notion of losing your health insurance leaves you as vulnerable as possible in some of the most important moments of your life. And that they would consider this provision to eliminate health insurance coverage for 16 million families is unimaginable and cruel. Let's not act like there is a unified Republican front on this issue. Even some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't want to be here at this moment, jamming this unpopular bill through this chamber under arbitrary deadlines. One of my colleagues took a look at tax breaks, and you're going to hear them say over and over again, well, the average family, if we don't act, the average family is going to have to pay more in taxes. There's a way around that. If we limit any tax breaks in this bill, in this effort, to people making $400,000 a year or less, $400,000 a year or less, it virtually eliminates 2/3 of the cost of this undertaking. And it means you don't have to take away the health insurance of 16 million families. So there are ways to do tax breaks which make sense. Count this Democrat in with the Republicans for helping working families who are struggling to get by, and a lot of them are, living paycheck to paycheck. And the notion that we would say to them, we're going to take away your health insurance, we're going to raise the cost of health insurance for you,
Seafood Troost. Thank you
is
for the
no
sub on
answer to
YouTube,
their
my man.
problems.
Welcome in.
Behind closed doors, my Republican colleagues continue to be consumed with infighting, bickering over the bill's substance, and for good reason. We have a process here which is almost impossible to explain to an ordinary person of how we reach reconciliation. The parliamentarian's office, and she's sitting here, God bless you for what you've been through for the last several months, and all your staff, have to make decisions on a daily basis over and over again as to whether or not provisions of this bill are eligible under the law that governs the United States Senate. We're in the process of debating this on the Senate floor. I see our ranking member on the Budget Committee, Senate Budget Committee, the senator from Oregon. We're in the process of still appealing to the parliamentarian's office on provisions in the bill. This is truly a work in progress. I think what they do know is troubling. and it
Appreciate
should
the
be.
sub too, Franklin.
This bill would be a disaster for hospitals. The Senate Republican bill, unfortunately, is going to endanger hospitals all over the United States. But if you happen to live in a small town, rural area, and I represent a lot of them in the state of Illinois, you're the most vulnerable. You are the target. When they cut back on Medicaid programs, these are the hospitals that will close their doors. What's the impact of a hospital closing its door in a downstate community in Illinois? Devastating. Hospitals are not only the center for emergency medical care, good doctors, nurses, and such, they are also a major economic force in small town America. Take away a hospital and then try to attract a new business to your community. Good luck. This Senate bill cripples one of the main ways that states fund their Medicaid programs and keep hospitals afloat, especially rural and low-income areas. It's called the provider tax. Earlier this week, a Republican senator, circulated a flyer to his fellow caucus members, so they're all on notice, detailing just how much each state will lose in Medicaid provider tax funding under their proposal. Let's take a look at my neck of the woods, the Midwest. Iowa would lose $4.1 billion. Missouri, $6.1 billion. Kentucky, $12 billion. Louisiana would lose $20 billion. North Carolina,
Whoa, 20 million billion. That's a lot.
Senator
What
Tillis
did they do?
and I were in conversation yesterday, and he used that very same figure. His analysis says that to go forward with this bill cuts Medicaid reimbursement in his home state of North Carolina by a whopping $38.9 billion. This list of states and what they will lose was passed around by a Republican senator to his own caucus. They know what they're up against here. If Republicans have their way and pass this bill, hospitals will be forced to shrink or eliminate services. In Decatur, Illinois, one of the major hospitals facing the crunch time had to make a decision whether they keep their doors open. They did, but they eliminated OBGYN, delivering babies, and they eliminated all mental health and addiction counseling, two critical areas for the hospitals. So these doctors, this bill will force hospitals to shrink or eliminate services. Doctors and nurses will leave, and in some cases, the hospital will close. Imagine that in a rural area, a remote area, an extra 45 minutes, an extra hour in the car with somebody in the front seat you love very much who's in a desperate situation. As it stands today, half of the rural hospitals around the country already operate in a danger zone. And it's the same thing for children's hospitals. Do you have one in your community that you've used? I do.
Okay, guys, it is roughly 15 minutes from my birthday. So I have a little thing planned that I'm going to do at midnight. And yeah, I got to go ahead and get prepped for it. So we're going to go ahead and end this update hour here. We went a little over, but important stuff. I'll continue covering this bill upon my next news and politics stream. And if you guys want to wish me a birthday wish, just like this stream and hit that sub button. I will see you guys in about 15 minutes. Appreciate it. I'll catch you on the next one. Peace out, y'all.